Are tensions de-escalating between the U.S. and China? Red spoke earlier to Stephen Nagy, Japan Institute for International Affairs visiting fellow. Let's have a look.
Professor, Secretary of State Blinken recently visited Beijing. Many have said that this has lowered tensions between the US and China, but has it really?
I think that there are really there's good points, bad points, and the reality of the relationship. And in terms of the good points, any dialogue is positive. I think the fact that we saw the secretary speak to his counterpart Wang Yi, as well as speak to Xi Jinping, does demonstrate that both sides see the importance of communication. The bad side, though, is that really, 30 minutes with Xi Jinping, including an interpreter, which means about 15 minutes of substantial discussion, if really means that they didn't have the ability to really, go into the details, at least at the leadership level. The ugly is that there's still in both China and the United States real distrust, deep distrust with each other, and the structural competition between the two states for hegemony over the Indo-Pacific is really deepening. And I think the difference between the hegemony that I'm talking about is that China very much views hegemony through the lens of countries in its neighborhood, as well as territories deferring to Beijing's wishes, where the United States has a more inclusive form of hegemony or benevolent hegemon, in that it works with like-minded countries like Japan, like South Korea, like Australia, like Singapore, like Vietnam in many ways, as well as political entities like Taiwan to build a more rules-based, stable region. And I think that's a fundamental difference in the forms of leadership that these two states will offer.
Going to the elephant in the room, Taiwan, do you feel that these discussions also involve Taiwan?
Well, the United States is continuing to try to send the message to Beijing that it's one China policy. And when I say it's one China policy, I'm saying the United States one China policy, not China's one China policy, hasn't changed. And this is prioritizing peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits based on the mutual understanding that Beijing and Washington have established over the past 40 years. We see that the Biden administration, through Anthony Blinken, again stressing this idea that some kind of Taiwan contingency has global ramifications, not just regional ramifications, and that makes Taiwan a global public good. And what I mean by that is that the United States, Australia, Canada, where I'm from, Japan, South Korea, and other states in the region all have a very deep interest in Taiwan's future, in peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits, the status quo, and ensuring that no forced reunification or unification happens by Beijing. And I think those messages were sent to Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's counterparts, and equally so, I'm sure Beijing sent the message that Taiwan is an inherent part of Chinese territory based on its understanding of history. And this understanding of history is not shared by much of the world, as is the one China policy is interpreted differently by much of part of the world. And I think that we should be very nuanced in terms of how we understand what kind of discussions are being taken place when it comes to Taiwan.
You talked earlier about how the US projects its power differently from China in bringing allies, especially democratic ones. And you talked about Canada, where you're originally from, and Taiwan's closest neighbor is Japan, where you also reside. And how do you feel these democracies can help Taiwan to protect its democracy and from forced what Beijing calls as unification, or what many in Taiwan call as an annexation?
The reality is that if you're going to have economic relations with China, that you have to have a one China policy, and that one China policy is subject to interpretation, but it means that Beijing is the legal representative of China. But at the same time, I think countries like Japan, Canada, Australia, and others, to strengthen Taiwan's democracy and its civil society, need to encourage as many non-state forms of exchanges as possible. This can be student exchanges, university exchanges, exchanges between unions, such as fishery unions. And we've seen Japan and Taiwan, for example, overcome the challenges related to the Senkaku Islands or the Diaoyutai Islands that are voiced in Taiwan by basically letting the fishery unions work together to jointly exploit the resources in and around these territories. So I think that it's really critical that we continue to build those non-state levels of engagement. I'm a real advocate of including Taiwan in the World Health Organization, bringing in Taiwan into the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think that there's a place for Taiwan in many other different international organizations because Taiwan, again, provides such an important example of what a Chinese democracy can be in the region and how transparent and fair elections can take place and how a civil society can be an engaging, active part of governance. And I think these are really important examples for all the countries within the region.
We've also seen a strong reaction from the recent arms sales from the US to Taiwan by China. There was some name calling in that as well. How do you feel the US and allies such as Japan, Canada should react in terms of boosting Taiwan's self defense capabilities?
First, the arms sales are regular, and Beijing knows this. And it's important for the United States to continue to say that this is a regular pattern of behavior that we've engaged in for the past 40 years and has contributed to peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. Second, what can Japan, Canada, Australia, and other countries do? I think that they should be also voicing the concern that, or the reality that this is something that has not been this is not something out of the blue. It's something that's been predictable, and that Beijing's reactions are I think, over the top. I think that other countries like Japan and Australia and Canada need to think about how they can encourage and support Taiwanese deterrence capabilities. And here it could be the provision of some technologies, it could be the provision of some military tools, it could be in the form of joint military training. And that could be with the self-defense forces of Japan or otherwise. I do think that there's a place for joint Taiwan Strait transits, where, for example, Canada, Japan, maybe Germany transit the Taiwan Straits to demonstrate that these are international waters. So there's a lot of different formula to build Taiwanese deterrence capabilities so that it can resist a forced reunification. But at the same time, I think that these countries should help Taiwan and Taiwanese citizens themselves build that internal resilience that would be necessary in the case of some kind of cross-state contingency.